Welcome to The Breach Show, featuring sharp analysis on politics and social movements in Canada. I'm your host, Desmond Cole. BC Premier David Eby has been threatening to change or even suspend laws enshrining Indigenous rights in his province. Eby has suggested that private property could be under threat because of court decisions recognizing Indigenous land and title. First Nations say they're not coming for Canadians' private property, and Eby is whipping up unfounded fears. So why are so many BC politicians upset with a law that received unanimous support only a few years ago? And what happens if they weaken it? Joining me to discuss all this is Pam Palmater, a lawyer, professor, writer, and a member of the Eel River Bar First Nation. She is the chair of Indigenous governance at the Toronto Metropolitan University, a regular media commentator, and the author of several books, including Indigenous Nationhood and Warrior Life. Nice to see you, Pam.
Oh, it's great to be back.
And as we get started, just a reminder to our audiences to like and subscribe if you want more bold journalism for transformation. Okay, Pam, the law causing all of this furor in BC is called the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act, or DRIPA. And those words might sound familiar to people because this law puts into action UNDRIP, or the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which the Trudeau government enacted 5 years ago. So to begin, please help us understand what DRIPA is and what it does.
Well, DRIPA is actually pretty historic because it is the province of BC affirming that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, all of those human rights that are recognized and protected in that document that already applies to Canada, specifically is part of the laws of BC, and that all BC laws must be consistent with that. And that law was passed under the former Premier John Horgan. But interestingly enough, it was when under that same government, when Eby was the Attorney General, he also put forth an amendment to BC's Interpretation Act to say that no laws in BC can abrogate or derogate, like take away from, constitutionally protected Aboriginal and treaty rights under Section 35, or the human rights that are protected in UNDRIP. So that's very specific, so that you've got one law saying UNDRIP applies, and you've got another law saying, and oh, by the way, courts, if you have to interpret, these apply.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's court decisions that seem to have troubled Eby to the point where he's threatening to either suspend or amend certain parts of DRIPA. There's a case in particular that's being cited as a source of a lot of anxiety in BC called the Cowichin decision, which recognized the Cowichin Nation's title over hundreds of hectares of land in the Richmond, BC area, which includes a lot of private property that's currently owned by Canadians. Can you help us understand this Cowichin decision?
Yeah, so first of all, the majority of Aboriginal title court cases come from BC. You had the Delgamuukw case, which was historic, saying, yeah, Aboriginal title exists and we have to recognize it. Then you have the Chilcotin case, which said, oh yeah, here's the very first declaration here. And now you have another one. So it's not new. And I think what the fear is that First Nations are going to march into residential neighborhoods and start kicking people out of their homes, which they have no legal authority to do. And not a single First Nation in the history of Aboriginal title claims have ever said, we're kicking out all these, private interests and farms and everything else. That's not how it works. Aboriginal title, Crown title, and private interests, none of them are absolute, and you can have third-party interest and Aboriginal title over the same land. It's about sitting down and negotiating, okay, well, what does that mean? Does that mean a part of the taxes will go to the First Nation? Does that mean there's going to be joint governing decisions over, like, bylaws and things like that? But under no conditions does it mean anyone is losing their home. It never has been. But that's the biggest misinformation fear campaign that has ever existed since First Nations made Aboriginal title claims.
Okay, but this is what's so confusing about what's happening in British Columbia, because the law doesn't allow for Indigenous nations to come and take private property away from its owners. The First Nations say they have no intention of doing that. And moreover, and David Eby knows this as Premier and, as you said, former Attorney General, this court case about Cowichin started before DRIPA was the law in BC. So, Pam, what's going on? Why is the Premier citing this law if it's not putting into play the things that he's suggesting?
I just have to say, in general, whether it's a federal or provincial government, Aboriginal rights are well and good, and we support them and we respect them and we uphold them until we have to, right? So it's easy to put it in the Constitution. Governments had no problem saying we're going to constitutionally protect Aboriginal treaty and Aboriginal title rights. But then as soon as court cases start saying, okay, they have rights, then it's a big panic. Oh no, all economic interests are going to be impacted. All third parties are going to be impacted. We're going to lose political power over specific territories. So it really comes down to political power. But I think the biggest issue really is not even the third party, it's the corporate interests. So it's the corporate interests, for the most part, that drive the fear-mongering and misinformation. And you see all of these social media campaigns that, the world is coming to an end. I think that's the biggest thing here. And we all know that corporate interests have disproportionate amount of political influence. So the corporate interests, like in the first case that really upset them, that said that the free-for-all mining claims that can be made by non-native people over First Nation territories, that's wholly inconsistent with UNDRIP. And so you need to do something about that, change that process, because there needs to be consultation, free, prior, and informed consent. So my suspicion that it's probably somewhere around there, and you can never get away from elections. First this was going to be a confidence issue, and then you've got NDP MPs saying, well, we don't support this either. And then all of a sudden, well, it's not going to be a confidence issue, because what if our government falls? And so, and the world has changed. You know how in the last 3 or 4 years, the far right, anti-women, anti-human rights, anti-social justice, anti-environment has just flourished all over. And so conservative governments have been picking that up and trying to run with these populist ideologies and to see how effective it is. So there's a lot more at play than anything that could really happen.
The Conservative Party in BC, which had 0 seats, by the way, when DRIPA was actually passed. DRIPA was passed unanimously. But the Conservatives were really out of the political picture at that time. They've made a resurgence in British Columbia, and they don't just want to alter or amend DRIPA. They want to repeal it completely, and they don't want to say what, if anything, they would replace it with. So do you think that this is part of that conservative backlash that you're talking about, or is this actually, it seems to be something that politicians across the board in British Columbia, even though it might be driven by the Conservatives, are comfortable putting into the public sphere?
Yeah, so I'm not surprised at all by the Conservatives, because we've seen this wave where Conservatives are, hopping on this far-right populist, hate campaign, and in hopes that it'll get them elected. I mean, look at Doug Ford, look at Pierre Poilievre, and others. And so I'm not at all surprised that Conservatives were looking for a way to gain some kind of support. And right now, the only kind of support they could realistically gain in a progressive province like BC, a more progressive, is to try to go with this populist campaign, because keep in mind, we've seen a rise in anti-First Nations, Indian residential school denialism. There's like a whole bunch of that brewing. And you see behind that, who's behind that? Conservative people, hoping that they will get some kind of notoriety, popularity, maybe become the next government in BC. Hope not. And that is a disservice to people, BC residents and First Nations, because a lot of that is based on hate, anger, fear, misinformation, not reality.
David Eby is a new Democrat premier, of course. And when he said that he's first wanted to change or amend or suspend parts of DRIPA, First Nations came out in full force saying absolutely not. The First Nations Leadership Council in BC basically says Eby is threatening human rights in the province and that they're going to take legal action if he does do anything. So he has changed his position, Pam, like 5 or 6 times in recent weeks on this issue. He says he's going to amend DRIPA. Then he says he's going to suspend parts of it. He says it's non-negotiable. And then earlier this week, after a letter from the First Nations Leadership Council, he said, we're not actually going to touch DRIPA at all. What do you make of his inability to make a decision on this issue?
Nothing about politicians surprises me. However, that's a bit surprising because he was part of the government that fully 100% supported DRIPA. And then he was the Attorney General when they made sure to also amend the Interpretation Act to make sure that, you know, if courts have to interpret this, that must be consistent with Indigenous rights. And it was celebrated. And this was something that came about jointly between BC government and First Nations. And there's very strong relations, political relations, partnerships, you name it in BC. BC First Nations are very, very strong in that area and always work on relationships. I mean, he was there at the Haida title announcement saying, this is great, this is historic, this is how recognition of rights should happen. So I was like, okay, he's still good on rights recognition. But as soon as the court case says, wait a second, BC, your mining regime of free for all without even talking to First Nations, that's not consistent with UNDRIP. Then he starts backtracking and says, oh no, legal liability on the part of the province. And oh no, because keep in mind, who's primarily making these stakes, right? They tend to be larger corporations. What people need to remember is, even if UNDRIP didn't apply in BC, the Supreme Court of Canada has said over and over and over and over and over again that there is a legal duty to consult when it's mining or anything that's happening on First Nation traditional territories, a legal duty to consult, accommodate their interests, and in many cases get consent. So that law already exists in Canada. That's why when you see a politician backing up and saying, oh, wait, this could be disastrous, you think, okay, well, what's really at play here? Because surely he hasn't had a philosophical change of heart. Let's keep in mind, Canadian mining corporations are some of the biggest in the world and the most devastating to Indigenous territories all over the world, including Canada, and has some of the highest human rights violations that they get away with near impunity. So I suspect there's the political element, but there's also this corporate push behind the scenes.
And just to clarify for our listeners, there was another court case that has also kind of spurred this DRIPA conversation late last year, where a court said that the ability of corporations to initially stake a claim to mining rights without consulting First Nations actually was not on, and that it has to be changed. And so that also contributed a lot to this DRIPA conversation that is now being had in BC. But Pam, you mentioned BC is the only province to have made an implementation law around the rights of Indigenous people. What happens? What's at stake if this law is altered or suspended?
Well, I think a lot's at stake because there have been decades of relationship building between the provincial government and BC First Nations. There's like 230-ish First Nations in BC. Many of them have already won their court cases. They've already won their court cases on fishing, on commercial interests, on Aboriginal title. So they have a very strong legal backing behind them. They're also very politically astute, business astute. They have tons of agreements with governments and industry. So what's at risk is that could all be torn apart. Like there will be no agreements going forward, that, development could come literally to a halt if they start saying we're going to ignore First Nation interests, because we're decades past that. Supreme Court of Canada has put us decades past that. So there's a real disconnect in what the lay of the land already was, that this doesn't change anything. The Supreme Court of Canada is going to look at a free-for-all mining regime and say, of course, this violates Section 35 Aboriginal and treaty rights. And so that's why you have to look and say, there's something else at play here. Because the other thing that really doesn't get talked about in the Cowichin case, it says, oh, and by the way, we're suspending the effects of this judgment so that the parties can get together and negotiate. So nothing is happening. There is no requirement to suspend DRIPA. The court case has already happened. You might try to suspend DRIPA now, but the court judgment has already been here, and they've already suspended the judgment. So there's no immediate panic, and it really is about coming and talking and negotiating it. It's always been come to the table, negotiate, respect Indigenous rights, and that isn't hard. But they keep trying to relitigate the very same issues that have already been litigated.
If we pull back from this a bit, from British Columbia, we see a country that's political leadership right now is united in its desire to develop resources in ostensibly a means to counteract U.S. President Donald Trump and his tariffs on many Canadian goods. There's a commentary from a couple of months ago by Matthew D. Mitchell of the Fraser Institute, and I'm going to share a quote from that with you. He warned that elected officials and courts are that, quote, undermine individual property rights by promoting Aboriginal rights and title. And he goes on to say, if Canada's longstanding tradition of strong property right protection continues to be eroded, our long-term prospects for economic well-being and prosperity will be at risk, unquote. Do you see this current battle in British Columbia as part of a bigger pattern of pitting Indigenous rights against Canadian prosperity?
The more conservative, especially the more far-right conservative ideologies, have always been anti-First Nation rights, anti-First Nation identity. So this has been something that's been ongoing for a very long time. There's always institutes that say, oh, private property. But they also tend to forget that the so-called private property or fee simple title that they hold to their house is subject to a whole host of municipal bylaws and can be expropriated in a heartbeat by federal and or provincial governments. There's lots of things that can happen to private property, whether it's commercial or private, like individual interests, that already exist and could potentially be a threat to that individual property owner's rights. All Aboriginal rights is another element to address. And I think what gets forgotten in this conversation is, hello, you're trying to advocate for all of these rights over lands that were stolen from us. So it's a bit rich to hear, like, oh no, what about our rights? Well, oh no, what about our rights? When we're just trying to get a small fraction of our land back, and no one's asking for the private property, of Joe Blow in his house, where the majority of lands in Canada are held by what's known as unoccupied Crown territory. There is more than enough to give back. There's more than enough wealth to share. The UN has already said Canada being one of the most wealthiest countries in the world. What on earth? How could it possibly be that you're not sharing the wealth with First Nations? And by wealth, I don't mean unabated pipelines and tar sands and all the things that destroy the environment. There's a lot of wealth. There's taxation sharing. There's revenue sharing from other businesses. There's all the licenses and permits and all of the other things that generate wealth for governments, municipal, provincial, or federal, not being shared with First Nations. That could be, and that doesn't even rely on the extractive industry. So we just really need to put all of the cards on the table and say, look, like, what are we really talking about here? Because misinforming the country is not doing anyone any good. The other thing that really is important, because it goes back to your original question about what's the impact here, there's an impact outside of BC, because First Nations are trying to get other provinces to enact similar legislation in the province, because the federal government has already done so. So BC did, federal government, so all federal laws now, which includes any permits, licenses, and authorizations, many of which provinces require because of the nature of, say, the industry, must be compliant with UNDRIP and Section 35 of the Constitution. That's already a layer there. And then I guess the bigger issue is that UNDRIP has always applied to Canada. I mean, despite the fact that they originally voted against it and then changed their mind in 2016 and say, you know what, we support it unconditionally. In the international community, when it comes to any international court cases, any international claims, tribunals, you name it, UNDRIP applies, because the majority of nations in the UN General Assembly voted in favor of it. So there's so many multiple levels, and I guess I'll just say this one last point, that if I was a Supreme Court of Canada justice and the federal government has enacted its own UNDRIP legislation, which means all federal laws and policies must be in compliance with UNDRIP, and a province, let's just say, I don't know, Ontario, Alberta, says, yeah, well, human rights don't apply for First Nations in our province. The fact that it applies internationally and at the national level, and the fact that internationally human rights laws that we've ratified, we've signed on to, apply to the state, and it doesn't matter how a state is set up, whether it's a federal, provincial, or federal and state, like in the United States, that doesn't matter. It applies to Canada as a state. So it'd be pretty hard for the Supreme Court of Canada to say, well, in one province, First Nations get human rights, in another province, they don't. So I would argue that there's a legal case to be made that it's not required that other provinces do the same thing. I think they should, for clarity and a commitment to reconciliation. But we're going to be in a pretty hard spot if BC says, yes, we're committed to it, yes, it applies. You have some court cases that say, yeah, it applies. And then you try to suspend it afterwards. I don't know that a court's going to allow that to happen.
Well, it's interesting because when UNDRIP was ratified by the federal government, a lot of the provinces said, we can't get on board with this for the exact reason that you're saying, because it's going to violate our jurisdiction as provinces, even though it's law in the entire country. So it remains to be seen if any other province is going to come on board and try to pass the same kind of implementation law that BC has. I wanted to get your opinion on some news that's just come out in the last couple of days, suggesting that the Carney government in Ottawa is in favor of now a different route for a pipeline to British Columbia to the coast that has been being talked about. There's been speculation between, of course, Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith about a route that could pass through northern British Columbia, that could pass through the territories of a lot of First Nations that say they don't want such a project, that would potentially have to mean changes to the tanker ban in northern BC. So now we're getting word from the Globe and Mail, Robert Fife and others reporting that there's a southern pipeline route that the government says goes through fewer nations that might not want it, and that might just be more politically viable. Do you have any thoughts on this news?
The problem here is when governments and their economic advisory councils and corporations sit around a table and say, hey, what should we do here? Instead of really talking to First Nations first, because the law is free prior and informed consent. So not while a project's on the go, not when it's been announced, not while it's already underway, but before it even becomes a project, sitting down with First Nations and saying, does this work? Not just for you. Does this work for you? But do we have any environmental concerns? Do we have social concerns, like the huge numbers of people in man camps who raise the levels of violence and and disappearances of Indigenous women around those man camps. So there's a lot of potential issues. The long-term pollution that never gets remediated by the corporation. So how about we sit down and talk about this first and see what's possible and what isn't? Are there alternatives? I mean, we're not going to go gasoline free overnight. I don't think anyone thinks that's going to happen. However, we don't have to go full blast destroying First Nations and the environment for the sake of Trump has imposed some tariffs which have been found to be illegal, and now he has to refund a bunch of his own corporations. Like, we cannot have Canadian policy based on what Trump says in a tweet from day to day. I would also say I'm also very concerned about the transition of the Liberal Party. Again, there's politics at play, right? You want to be in power. You want to stay in power. How do you do that when you know that the Conservatives are like nipping right at your heels? That's how much support they have. Well, you be more conservative. You be more corporate led. You start having more super far right conservative people in your party. And so with that comes corporate interests above all else. And I think Canadians should realize that that's above Canadian social programs. That's above healthcare, above education, above mental health supports, above human rights, above all of Canadian interests too. So this isn't just about First Nations. This is also about Canadians. If we don't have any money for healthcare, where do you think that money is going? Is it going to, say, I don't know, the military industrial complex maybe? And so these are things that Canadians need to think about beyond partisan politics.
They've said in the First Nations Leadership Council, for example, in BC, that they will legally fight back in the case of DRIPA being altered. But of course, there's also this suggestion and the option for First Nations of blockades and other forms of civil demonstration that have been used in the past. And that could be part of the reason that David Eby keeps flip-flopping back and forth on this issue. But, given the possibility of these kinds of disruptions in the future, if the government wants to mess with Indigenous rights and land title, I want to ask you about the recent revelation from last month, Pam, in a CBC expose about the federal government enacting surveillance on Indigenous activists in the 1970s. I don't know how much of a surprise this reporting by CBC was, but it was powerful and it forced an immediate response from the government. It was called the Native Extremism Program. What was your thinking when you saw this reporting from CBC?
First of all, not surprised. We've always known that. Second of all, the media tends to be packaging this as like a historic problem. Like, isn't this awful? There should be some kind of apology. What about the fact that it is continued? And there's been tons of reporting on how CSIS, even D&D, the RCMP, they have special units that have continued to monitor and increase surveillance against First Nations activists like Cindy Blackstock, who goes to court with kids and cookies and teddy bears, monitoring her. She was already compensated for that. Peaceful movements, the Idle No More movement, grandmothers, sitting around making crafts to sell to support the resistance. So it hasn't stopped is the problem. It's gotten worse. It's been enabled by amendments, the anti-terrorism legislation and amendments to various acts. So what really surprises me is how it's been historicized. Like, look at how terrible that was. It's like, how about how terrible it is right now? How about during the Wet'suwet'en and Chukwetmik and Sightsee Dam and Fairy Creek? They have a specialized RCMP unit, a KERG, that only exists in BC, that's only there to protect corporate interests, and that had been authorized to use lethal overwatch to protect these corporate interests. retired RCMP going to work as private security for these industries, RCMP pensions being invested in these pipeline industries. I mean, and the fact that we're still monitored and surveilled. But yes, Canadians may be shocked that this happened in the past. I think they should be more shocked that it happens today, given that we have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we have a Constitution, we have human rights, everything else. It seems to be like a non-discussion. That's what concerns me. And the other thing that concerns me is that RCMP in particular, because they're the worst for it, the RCMP, maybe CSIS, D&D, will apologize for what was done in the past, while Canadians won't know, oh, look, we're just going to ramp that up in BC because BC First Nations may actively protect the right to live on their territories and protect the right to protect the waters and the plants and animals.
That you mentioned, Kirk, the Community Industry Response Group, an RCMP unit that has been surveilling Indigenous peoples in BC. It got so much attention that it changed its name, and it's now called the Critical Response Unit. Same policing, just a different name.
And they beg to be on that unit. Like the worst cowboys of the worst beg to be on that unit. So it's not good to begin with. And we've already had dangerous encounters with law enforcement. We know we've had a land defender that was shot and killed by the OPP. We know in BC that the biggest RCMP invasion and attack on people was during peaceful sun dances by a handful of people, and then they brought out armored vehicles and explosive devices and shot thousands of rounds of ammo at peaceful, ceremonial First Nations. So if that's okay, what's next?
We never know what's coming next, Pam, but we always appreciate your insights on what's been happening and what we can look forward to in the future. Thank you, as always, for joining us.
Thanks for covering this. This is important for all Canadians.
Our pleasure. If you like what you've heard on The Breach Show, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you want to support our work, please become a sustaining member to help us produce more journalism for transformation. And you can do that by going to breachmedia.ca/support. Thanks for listening.